She rolled her eyes as she walked past the old black man, ignoring his request for service. The other customers laughed, watching him sit alone, humiliated. But what she didn't know, the diner's owner had been watching, and when the truth came out, her entire world flipped upside down. The small diner hummed with the low murmur of conversations and the occasional clatter of plates. The walls adorned with vintage signs and black and white photographs gave the place a nostalgic charm, but only for those welcome in it. The air was thick with the scent of sizzling bacon and fresh coffee, yet beneath the cozy atmosphere, an undercurrent of quiet hostility lingered. When James Carter stepped through the door, the energy in the room shifted. Dressed in a neatly pressed suit and polished shoes, James carried himself with quiet dignity. His 76 years of life showed in the lines on his face, but his posture remained strong, shoulders squared as he took slow, measured steps toward an empty booth in the back. The diner was packed, almost entirely with white customers. Conversations that had flowed so easily stuttered. A few heads turned, some lingered, their gazes dripping with the kind of scrutiny that didn't need words to be understood. They didn't think he belonged. James ignored them. He had learned long ago that acknowledging the stares gave them power. Instead, he slid into the booth, adjusting his coat and settling in comfortably. Across the diner, Rebecca stood behind the counter, arms crossed. She was young, 22, blonde, and full of self-importance. She had been working here for just over a year, but she acted like she owned the place. Her eyes flicked toward James, her lips pulling into a slight smirk. She didn't move. Instead, she grabbed a coffee pot and walked toward a table where a group of white men had just sat down. Even though they had arrived after James, she poured their coffee, flashing them a smile, chatting casually as if James wasn't even there. Minutes passed, then 10. James sat still, his hands resting on the table, fingers interlocked. He watched as Rebecca floated between tables, her tray expertly balanced, her voice light and friendly, for everyone but him. The other customers noticed. A few snickered. An older man in a business suit muttered something under his breath, shaking his head. James knew what he had said. He didn't need to hear it. Finally, when the clock ticked past 15 minutes, James lifted a hand. He didn't wave it impatiently, didn't snap his fingers. He just raised it slightly, a polite, silent request for service. Rebecca let out a loud, exaggerated sigh. She turned, walking toward him slowly, deliberately, like she had all the time in the world. When she reached the table, she didn't greet him. She didn't smile. Instead, she folded her arms and stared. "Yeah," she said flatly. James, ever the gentleman, gave a slight nod. "Could I get some coffee, please?" His voice was deep, steady. Rebecca rolled her eyes. "You sure you can afford it?" The table next to him laughed. James' fingers tightened on the table. He had been through this before, but today was different. The diner was alive with the familiar sounds of clinking glasses, the murmur of conversations, and the occasional burst of laughter. The warm scent of coffee and bacon filled the air, wrapping around the packed room like an invisible invitation, but not for everyone. James Carter sat alone in his booth, his presence acknowledged by no one. For the past 15 minutes, he had watched the same young blonde waitress weave through the restaurant, moving like clockwork, her tray balanced with ease. She had stopped at every table but his. James wasn't blind. He saw the way she smiled at the white customers, the way her voice lifted in friendly chatter as she filled coffee cups and scribbled down orders. And yet, every time she passed his table, her demeanor changed. Her posture stiffened. Her eyes flicked away, like she was avoiding something unpleasant. James had been patient, his fingers resting on the smooth tabletop, the tips lightly tapping in rhythm with the ticking clock on the wall. He had been here before, but today something felt different. Rebecca, the 22-year-old waitress with a permanent smirk, finally turned toward his booth. She didn't smile. She didn't greet him. She just stood there staring. "What do you want?" she asked, her tone dripping with impatience. James looked up at her, his expression calm, betraying none of the quiet anger stirring beneath his ribs. "Coffee, black, and eggs with toast, please." Rebecca let out a scoff, shaking her head like he had just inconvenienced her. "You sure you can afford it?" A few customers at nearby tables chuckled. A couple of young men at the counter smirked. nudging each other as if they were sharing some unspoken joke. James didn't react. His hands stayed folded neatly in front of him, his shoulders squared, his posture unshaken. Rebecca rolled her eyes and turned away, walking off without another word. James watched as she moved effortlessly between tables, her entire demeanor shifting. To the white customers, she was different. Her voice became light, airy, welcoming. She laughed freely, leaned in when she spoke, flashed smiles as she poured steaming coffee into waiting cups. She stopped at a table where a young white couple had just sat down. They hadn't even picked up their menus yet, and still she took their order. James exhaled through his nose, the rhythm of his tapping fingers slowing slightly. The smell of coffee had once been something comforting. Now, it just felt bitter. 15 minutes later, the coffee pot in Rebecca's hand made its rounds. She stopped at the counter. She stopped at the booths. She poured fresh refills for the table beside him, but she never once stopped at his. The conversations around him continued like nothing was wrong. From across the diner, an older white man in a crisp gray business suit leaned back in his chair, watching James with an amused smirk. He took a sip of his coffee, then muttered, just loud enough for his friends to hear, "This ain't the 60s, old man." Get lost. A few customers laughed quietly, shaking their heads. James's fingers curled slightly against the tabletop. His heartbeat remained steady, his breath controlled. But he felt it, the way the room was watching, waiting. Rebecca returns. Finally, after 20 minutes, Rebecca sauntered back to his table. She had the coffee pot in her hand, but instead of setting it down gently, she plopped the cup in front of him, then slammed the pot beside it. The impact sent a ripple through the dark liquid, splashing over the rim, spilling onto the table. She didn't apologize. She didn't even acknowledge it. Instead, she grabbed the coffee pot and walked away. James stared at the small puddle of coffee, watching the way the liquid seeped into the cracks of the worn wooden table. The food never came. 5 minutes. 10. 15. James sat still, his hands resting on the table, his expression unchanged. But the silence around him was growing. A couple of white customers at nearby tables stole glances at him, shifting in their seats. Not all of them were comfortable, but none of them said anything. Rebecca walked past his table again, this time wiping her hands on a napkin. She stopped at the table beside his, grinning as she chatted with a man in a suit. Then finally she turned toward him, her lips curling into that same smug smirk. "You're still here?" she sneered. James inhaled deeply, his fingers tapping the table once. Then finally he spoke. "Young lady," he said, his voice calm but firm, "I asked for service. If you don't want to do your job, maybe you shouldn't be working here." The words hung in the air. The laughter that had lingered before faded. A couple of customers stopped talking. Rebecca let out a short, humorless laugh. "Oh, please," she scoffed, shaking her head. "Like someone like you could ever have a say in this place." A single tense beat of silence followed. James' fingers tightened against the table. He had been here before, but this time, things were about to change. The door swung open with a soft chime. The shift in the diner's atmosphere was instantaneous. Conversations dipped, forks paused midair, heads turned, eyes widening with recognition. A tall, poised black woman in her mid-40s stepped inside, her presence commanding attention without a single word. She wore a tailored navy blue suit, the sharp lines of the fabric screaming authority. Her polished heels clicked softly against the tiled floor as she strode forward, a leather handbag hanging effortlessly from her shoulder. She was the kind of woman people noticed, and she was looking directly at James Carter. The tension that had wrapped itself around the diner tightened. A few customers whispered among themselves. A couple of waitresses near the counter straightened up, their eyes darting between her and James. Rebecca, however, didn't seem fazed. She barely spared the woman a glance before rolling her eyes. Great, another problem to deal with. She grabbed her notepad and started toward another table, but before she could walk past James again, the woman spoke. "I'm sorry I'm late, Daddy." The room froze. James looked up and smiled, a warm, genuine, familiar smile. The woman leaned down and hugged him tightly, her embrace lingering just long enough for the realization to fully sink in. The whispers grew louder. Rebecca's steps halted. Her head snapped toward them, her brows furrowing in confusion. She blinked at the woman, then at James, her mind scrambling to piece together what had just happened. "Wait, what?" she stammered, a nervous laugh bubbling out of her. "You know him?" The woman slowly pulled away from James, then turned toward Rebecca with a stare so sharp, so icy it could have cut through glass. "Know him?" Her voice was calm, but there was no mistaking the steel underneath it. A beat of silence passed. Then she smirked. "He owns this place." The words hit the room like a gunshot. Gasps, sharp inhales, the sound of a fork clattering against a plate. A businessman at a nearby booth adjusted his tie nervously. A woman in a pearl necklace looked down at her coffee, suddenly too interested in the swirls of cream. James Carter, the man Rebecca had sneered at, had ignored, had humiliated. He wasn't just some random old black man. He was the owner of the diner. Rebecca's face drained of color. The confidence that had been so deeply embedded in her smirk shattered. She opened her mouth, but no words came out. The weight of every single thing she had done in the past half hour came crashing down on her all at once. Her heart hammered. This wasn't happening. It had to be a mistake. Her throat went dry. She swallowed. She stumbled over her words, forcing a nervous, breathy laugh. I didn't know." The woman tilted her head slightly, amusement flickering across her features. "Oh, you didn't?" Rebecca's mouth opened, then closed. She could feel the eyes of the entire diner on her. A waitress standing behind the counter took a step back, distancing herself, as if she wanted no part in the disaster unfolding. One of the young men at the counter who had been laughing before now shifted uncomfortably. The businessman who had muttered about James earlier quickly turned his attention to his phone, avoiding eye contact. Rebecca could feel the shift. Just minutes ago, the entire diner had been a playground for her arrogance. Now she was alone. Her chest tightened. Her eyes darted toward the door, as if she was already looking for an exit. But the woman wasn't done yet. She took a slow, deliberate step closer. "Tell me, Rebecca." Her voice was soft, controlled, but it dripped with something dangerous. "How long have you been working here?" Rebecca's tongue felt like sandpaper in her mouth. She barely managed to croak out, A year." The woman nodded slowly, clicking her tongue. "A year. Interesting." She folded her arms. "And in all that time, did you ever bother to ask who owned the diner?" Rebecca didn't answer. She couldn't. The woman let the silence stretch just long enough for it to become painful. Then finally she exhaled and shook her head. "You didn't, did you?" Rebecca's stomach twisted. James, who had been silent this entire time, finally leaned forward slightly, resting his elbows on the table. His voice was quiet. "Even. I built this diner with my own 2 hands." He glanced around the room, his gaze sweeping over the white customers who had laughed at him just minutes ago. "Every brick, every table, every sign on these walls, I put them there." His daughter nodded. "And now my father sits in his own establishment, and you," she gestured toward Rebecca, "thought he was beneath your service?" Rebecca's breath came in short, panicked bursts. The air in the diner suddenly felt suffocating. A deep, sinking realization curled in her stomach. There was no way out of this. She had been exposed, humiliated, and everyone had seen it. She clenched her fists at her sides, her nails digging into her palms. She had to fix this. Somehow. She forced a shaky smile, her voice cracking. I didn't mean any harm, it was just..." She swallowed. "A misunderstanding." The woman raised an eyebrow. "A misunderstanding?" Rebecca nodded rapidly. "Yes, I would have treated him better if I knew." The woman's eyes turned to ice. "If you knew he was the owner?" Rebecca's mouth snapped shut. The weight of the words settled like lead in the air. James slowly shook his head. His voice was quiet but firm. "You shouldn't need to know who someone is to treat them with respect." Rebecca felt her stomach drop. She had already lost, and she knew it. The silence in the diner was deafening. All the whispered jokes, the quiet laughter, the dismissive looks. Gone. Rebecca stood frozen, her breath coming in short, uneven bursts. Her mind screamed at her to say something, anything, to dig herself out of the hole she had just fallen into. But every time she opened her mouth, she found herself choking on the weight of her own arrogance. James Carter's daughter turned her gaze toward the room, sweeping over the customers who had sneered, laughed, and turned a blind eye. She took a slow step forward. "My father built this diner from nothing?" Her voice was calm, but there was an unmistakable edge underneath it. "Every brick, every table. You see all this?" She gestured around, her eyes narrowing. This was his dream. She let that settle for a moment. A few customers shifted uncomfortably in their seats. Others looked down at their plates, suddenly finding them far more interesting than the confrontation unfolding before them. She turned, her sharp gaze locking onto Rebecca. "And you," she said coldly, "thought you could treat him like he's nothing?" Rebecca's entire body tensed. I, I didn't know," she stammered, her voice cracking under the pressure. James' daughter's eyes darkened. "That's the problem." The words hit Rebecca harder than any slap could have. "You didn't care to know," she continued. "You didn't think he was worth knowing." Rebecca opened her mouth, then shut it. She had no defense. Nothing could justify what she had done. The same customers who had been laughing before now avoided looking at James entirely. Rebecca swallowed, her stomach twisting into knots. Her body felt unbearably hot, like the walls of the diner were closing in on her. She had spent the past 20 minutes treating James Carter like he was invisible. Now she was the one being ignored. James's daughter took another step toward her, her expression unreadable. Then, without hesitation, she reached forward and snatched the apron from Rebecca's waist. The room gasped. Rebecca blinked in shock. "You're fired!" The words were calm, final. Rebecca stared at her in disbelief. I, get out!" A sharp inhale from the crowd. Someone in the back let out a low whistle. One of the younger waitresses standing near the counter covered her mouth with her hand. Rebecca stumbled back a step. She looked around, waiting for someone to defend her. Surely someone would speak up. A customer, another waitress, maybe even the manager. But no one did. Not a single person said a word. Some just looked away. Others actually clapped. Rebecca's breath hitched. Her face burned. This couldn't be happening. She turned, desperate, locking eyes with one of the white businessmen she had served earlier. He quickly dropped his gaze to his coffee. Rebecca's hands curled into fists. They had all been laughing with her before. But now they had abandoned her. She took a step back, then another. Then without another word, she turned and rushed out of the diner. The door slammed shut behind her. The moment she was gone, a wave of murmurs swept through the room. One waitress near the counter shook her head. "Damn," another whispered. "She had that coming." A younger couple sitting near the window nudged each other, trying to suppress their smiles. And then, as if perfectly timed, the businessman who had mocked James earlier, the one who had said, "This ain't the 60s, stood up. He tossed some bills onto the table, adjusted his tie, and turned toward the door. But he didn't stride out confidently. Number. He slunk. His eyes stayed locked on the floor. His steps were quieter than they had been before, and he never once looked in James Carter's direction. As the door creaked shut behind him, the rest of the room sat in uncomfortable silence. For the first time that day, there was no laughter, no sneers, no smirks. James exhaled slowly, his fingers finally relaxing against the table. His daughter turned back to him, her expression softening. "I'm sorry, Daddy," she sighed, running a hand through her sleek hair. "I should have been here sooner." James shook his head. "You were here exactly when you needed to be." His voice was quiet but steady. For the first time that morning, his coffee was finally hot, and for the first time in a long time, he knew that no one in this diner would ever forget his name again. James Carter sat quietly in his booth, the scent of freshly brewed coffee finally reaching him without the bitter taste of humiliation. For the first time all morning, a waitress approached him with urgency. But this time, it wasn't to dismiss him. She was flustered, moving quickly, her notepad in hand. "Sir, I'm so sorry about earlier." Her voice trembled slightly. "Can I take your order now?" "Whatever you want. It's on the house." James glanced up at her. She was younger, nervous, clearly shaken by what had just happened. The other waitresses behind the counter hurried to prepare his meal, their movements fast, efficient, desperate to make up for what had happened. James simply nodded. "Just my coffee and eggs with toast." His daughter, still standing, crossed her arms. "Make it a full breakfast." The waitress nodded quickly, scribbling it down. "Right away." James leaned back in his seat, his fingers curling around the warm ceramic mug that had finally been placed in front of him. He lifted it to his lips, took a slow sip. It was hot, fresh, the way it should have been all along. His daughter slid into the booth across from him, resting her hands on the table. She sighed, shaking her head. "I should have been here sooner." James set his cup down, his gaze steady. "You were here exactly when you needed to be." She frowned slightly, her fingers drumming against the table. "Still, you shouldn't have had to sit here and take that." James exhaled slowly, glancing around the diner. The entire atmosphere had shifted. The racist customers who had laughed earlier now sat uncomfortably in their booths, quiet, suddenly uninterested in their meals. Some had already paid their checks and were making quick exits. One of the businessmen who had been watching with amusement earlier now kept his eyes firmly on his plate, stabbing at his food with a nervous grip. The group of young men at the counter, who had smirked at James when Rebecca first insulted him, no longer looked so smug. They were fidgeting, avoiding eye contact. And then one of them stood, a white man in his mid-20s, dressed casually in a flannel shirt and jeans. He looked hesitant, but his shoulders squared as he approached James's table. The diner went silent again. James set his coffee down, watching as the young man took a deep breath. "Sir?" His voice was quieter than before. James tilted his head slightly. "Yes?" The man swallowed hard, then exhaled. "I just wanted to say, I'm sorry." James blinked. The young man shifted awkwardly. "I laughed earlier. I shouldn't have. It wasn't funny." He rubbed the back of his neck. He hesitated. "I see it now." James studied him for a long moment. Then he nodded once. "Good," he said simply. The young man hesitated, then turned and walked back to his seat, his friends watching him, stunned. James lifted his coffee again. This time, when he took a sip, it tasted like respect. James Carter stood slowly, his hands pressing against the smooth wooden table as he rose to his feet. The hum of conversation had returned to the diner, but it wasn't the same as before. This time there were no sneers, no laughter at his expense. He took a slow breath, looking around the room. The diner he had built with his own hands. The walls, lined with framed photographs of a history long forgotten by most, held stories of his journey, stories of struggle, of perseverance, of building something from nothing. And yet even here, in his own establishment, racism had tried to push him out. But not today. Today justice had won. The waitress who had belittled him, gone. The people who had laughed at him, exposed. The next time a black elder walked into this diner, would they be ignored? Not anymore. James let that thought settle in his mind as he reached for his coat. As he slid it over his shoulders, the door to the diner swung open again. A group of reporters, tipped off by word of mouth, had gathered outside. One of them, a woman with a press badge clipped to her blazer, stepped forward. "Mr. Carter?" she called, voice hesitant, unsure if she should ask the question lingering in the air. James turned toward her, one brow lifting slightly. She hesitated only a second before pressing forward. "How do you feel about what happened today?" The diner fell silent again. All eyes turned to him, waiting for his response. James didn't answer immediately. Instead, he let his gaze sweep across the faces in the room, the ones who had laughed, mocked, ignored, the ones who had remained silent, too afraid or indifferent to speak up, and the ones who had learned something today. Finally, he spoke. His voice was calm but firm, unwavering. "Respect should never be something we have to fight for." He let the words linger, let them settle over the room like a heavy weight. Then he straightened his posture, adjusted his coat, and finished. "But if we must, we fight to win." With that, he turned and walked out. The door swung shut behind him, the sound echoing in the diner long after he was gone.